Dear students, welcome back to our third lecture of macroeconomics on aggregate expenditure and equilibrium output. Here we want to answer the question, what factors determine the level of a country's or a nation's total output or income? Put another way, what are those factors that could explain to us how a country's or a nation's measure of output or income, like GDP, changes over years or over time? The answer to this question is the well-known Keynes theory on output or income, which tells us or says simply that the level of aggregate or total expenditure in an economy as the sum of or in the form of four types of expenditure that include 1. Household consumption, denoted as C. 2. Business investment, denoted as I. 3. Government spending, denoted as G. And finally, net exports, denoted as X minus M, is what determines the level of its output or income. In what follows, we will see Keynes' view of the main determinants of households spending on consumer goods or consumption, and also business investment. We will also see how all the four components of aggregate expenditure can be put together in a simple Keynesian model to determine the equilibrium level of output or income. Specifically, we are going to cover 5 things. 1. The Keynesian theory of consumption, where we explain the principles of the Keynesian theory of consumption. 2. We differentiate between planned investment, I, versus actual investment, where we explain the difference between planned investment and actual investment. 3. Planned investment and the interest rate, or R, where we understand how planned investment is affected by the interest. 4. The determination of equilibrium output or income, where we explain how equilibrium output is determined. Finally, we look at the multiplier, where we describe the multiplier process and use the multiplier equation to calculate changes in equilibrium output. But before we go on to consider Keynes' explanation of both consumption and investment, we need to emphasize the concept of aggregate output and the concept of aggregate income. And let us remember that aggregate output refers to the total quantity of goods and services produced or supplied in an economy in a given period, while aggregate income is the total income received by all factors of production in a given period. We should note that in any given period, there is an exact equality between aggregate output or production and aggregate income. You should be reminded of this fact whenever you encounter the combined term aggregate output income. So, aggregate output or income, denoted as Y, is a combined term used to remind you of the exact equality between aggregate output and aggregate income. This means that we have to think in real terms, that is, output denoted as Y refers to the quantities of goods and services produced and not the dollars circulating in the economy. Let's begin with consumption. In his classic, famous book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, Keynes said that current income played the key role in determining consumption levels in the economy. That is, in math terms or mathematical terms, consumption is a function of the level of current income. So simply, Keynes says that consumption is a function of the level of current income. The consumption function just mentioned simply is a relationship between consumption and income. The graph we have here is a simple way to represent Keynes' idea of the so-called consumption function. It shows an upward sloping straight line that represents the relation between consumption, C, measured along the vertical axis, and income, which is measured along the horizontal axis. Note that it is drawn as a straight line just because we are assuming that C relates to Y, or income, in a linear fashion or in a linear form. So you can see that C is written as equal A, which is an intercept, plus B times Y, where B represents here the slope of the straight line. We can see that the aggregate consumption function shows the level of aggregate consumption at each level of aggregate income. Also, we can see that the upward slope indicates that higher levels of income lead to higher levels of consumption spending. We calculate or measure the slope of the straight line using the formula the rise over the run, or delta C over delta Y, which is equal to B. Here B represents the slope of the straight line of the consumption, representing the consumption function, and this is called the marginal propensity to consume. So we can use the following equation to describe a straight line consumption function. C equal A, which represents the intercept, plus B times Y, where B represents the slope of the straight line. Also, B represents the marginal propensity to consume, or the MPC. The MPC is that fraction of a change in income that is consumed or spent. It can be calculated using the formula, the marginal propensity to consume, or the slope of the consumption function equal delta C divided by delta Y, or can be calculated by dividing the change in consumption by the corresponding or the associated change in the level of income Y. We saw that the consumption function summarizes the relation between income and that part of income households spent on consumption goods, which we call consumption. Here we consider the remaining part of income which is not spent on consumption and which we call saving. Aggregate saving, denoted as S, represents the part of aggregate income that is not consumed. We can measure saving using the formula. S is identical to income, denoted as Y, minus consumption, denoted as C. Note here that the identity sign of the triple equal sign, it means that this equation is an identity or something that is always true by definition. An identity is something that is always true by definition. Based on the simple fact that income is identical to the sum of consumption, or C, and saving, or S, we can define the marginal propensity to save, or MPS. MPS is that fraction of a change in income that is saved. Also, we reach the conclusion that the sum of the marginal propensity to save and the marginal propensity to consume is identical to 1. MPC is the fraction of an increase in income that is consumed, or the fraction of a decrease in income that comes out of consumption, while MPS is the fraction of an increase in income that is saved, or the fraction of a decrease in income that comes out of the following table is a representation of the aggregate consumption function, which can be obtained from the equation C equal 100 plus 0.75 times Y. In this simple consumption function, consumption is 100 at an income of 0. At an income level of 80, we find that the corresponding level of consumption is 160. This level of consumption, 160, can be obtained by substituting for Y using 80. So we can reach the value of the corresponding consumption by adding 100 to the product, or multiplying 0.75 by 80, all sum to 160. We can do this for the remaining levels of income, starting from 100 going through to 1000. As income rises, so does consumption. This means that as Y increases, the value of C increases. For example, for every 100 increase in income, we realize that consumption rises by 75. When income increases from 0 to 80, consumption increases from 100 to 160. So the change in income is 80, while the change in consumption is 60. By dividing 60 by 80, we calculate the marginal propensity to consume in this case, and we will find that its value is going to be 0.75, which is the slope of the consumption line or the consumption function. Here we show how we derive the saving function from the consumption function. Simply, we need to subtract consumption from income to obtain saving. So applying this using the equation of the consumption function, which says that C equal 100 plus 0.75 y, and substituting for C in the equation, saying that y minus C equal S, we obtain the saving function, which is S equal minus 100 plus 0.25 times y. Substituting different values for income or y, starting from 0 ending with 1000, we can obtain the value of saving for each level of the different levels of income. Starting from 0, if we substitute the value of consumption 100, we find that corresponding value of saving is minus 100. And note here that minus 100 as a value of saving means that this amount of saving represents what we call this savings. And this savings is, in this case, the amount borrowed to finance a value of 100 of consumption, while at income level of 80 we find that the value of consumption is 160 and the corresponding value of saving is minus 80. If we go to a level of income of 1000, we will find that the value of consumption is 850, while the value of saving, which corresponds to it, is 150. Because S equal y minus C, it is easy to obtain or derive the saving function from the consumption function. Also, we can use a 45-degree line drawn from the origin, which can be used as a convenient tool or a simple way to compare consumption and income using a graph or graphically. So for example, at y equal 200, we find that consumption is 250. The 45-degree line shows us that consumption is larger than income by 50. Thus, S equal y minus C, which is equal minus 50. At y equal 800, consumption is less than income by 100. Thus, S equal 100 when y equal 800. Note that in practice, the decisions of households about how much to consume in a given period are also impacted or affected by three other things. The first, their wealth; second, the interest rate; and finally, their expectations of the future. This simply means that consumption, while mainly depends on the level of current income, as suggested by Keynes, as we saw before, but the value of consumption still depends on three other variables. Those are wealth, the interest rate, and the expectations about the future. Now we consider Keynes's explanation of business investment. But before we go into further detail into this explanation, we need to distinguish between two concepts relating to investment. The first is planned investment, and the second is actual investment. Planned investment, denoted as I, refers to those additions to capital stock and inventory that are planned by firms, while actual investment is the actual amount of investment that takes place. It includes items such as unplanned changes in inventory. Keynes suggests that the level of investments is mainly determined depending on the level of the interest rate. So, or that is, increasing the interest rate, other things being equal, or ceteris paribus, is likely to reduce the level of planned investment spending. When the interest rate falls, it becomes less costly to borrow, and more investment projects are likely to be undertaken. So this is the reason why Keynes suggests a negative or an indirect relation between planned investment, I, and the interest rate. The following graph shows the relationship between planned investment and the level of interest rates. And as we can see, that relation takes the shape of a downward sloping curve, exactly similar to the standard demand curve that we study in microeconomics. Planned investment spending is a negative function of the interest rate. That is, an increase in the interest rate, let's say from 3% to 6%, reduces the level or the amount of planned investment from I0 to I1. Note that the decision of a firm on how much to invest depends, among other things, on its expectation of future sales. The optimism or pessimism of entrepreneurs about the future course of the economy can have an important effect or impact on current planned investment. Keynes used the phrase animal spirits to describe the feelings of entrepreneurs.